For a mountain that has claimed the lives of hundreds of climbers over the last 50 years, one would think that the increasing casualties and extremely high climbing fees would cause Everest to lose its allure over time. However, the mountain has somehow been able to retain its allure as the world's highest peak, causing people to push beyond their limits and make poor decisions in a bid to break new records. Most of the disaster stories on Everest often start with climbers not listening to their sherpas, despite showing signs of altitude sickness, climbers defying the 1 p.m. rule, or even attempting feats that were clearly mission impossible. And even though some of these were done out of adventurous curiosity, to test the limits of human endurance, some were simply born out of the need to prove a point or break a new record on the world's highest peak. But regardless of their intentions, many of the fallen climbers on Everest were victims of their own poor decisions and Everest's unforgiving terrain. And this brings us to some of the worst tragedies that happened due to climbers' poor decisions. One of them is the tragic death of Frances, Everest's sleeping beauty. Frances Arsenteieff and her husband Sergei were a mountain climbing couple. They had first met on a hiking trail in Russia and had bonded over their adventurous nature. Together, they summited many Russian peaks, and in 1992, Frances became the first American woman to ski down Elbrus, the highest mountain in Europe. A few years later, Frances decided to break a new record by being the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. It was a daring attempt, but Frances, encouraged by her husband, was going to break the record. Now, if you're familiar with mountain climbing stories, you already know by now that the oxygen levels on high-altitude mountains are usually lower than what you're used to down below. At 8,000 meters, you're officially in the death zone, where the atmospheric pressure is not enough to sustain human life for long periods. Even with supplemental oxygen, many climbers still suffer from severe exhaustion or high-altitude sickness that may cause them to hallucinate or make poor decisions. The risk of death when climbing without supplemental oxygen is more than 5 times higher than not carrying one. And the few of those who achieved this feat were some of the most experienced climbers and sherpas who had acclimatized their bodies to the atmosphere over a period of time. But Frances and Sergei were determined to be the first couple to summit without supplemental oxygen. On May 19th, the couple arrived Camp 6 at 8,290. This was where they would begin their final push to the summit. Around 1 p.m. the next day, they began their summit push, but were forced to retreat after only climbing 100 meters. France's flashlights had broken, and there was no way they could continue climbing with poor visibility. The next day wasn't any better, as a heavy storm had started up the mountain. Unfortunately, they would have to wait another night in Camp 6 before finally beginning their summit push. But that itself was a major red flag. A well-known fact on Everest is that time is precious, and every delay or misstep could have grave consequences. On May 22nd, Frances and Sergei began their final ascent to the summit. But because they had already spent 2 nights in the death zone without supplemental oxygen, the effect of the thin air was starting to affect them. They had also started the summit push later than the standard time, another poor decision that shouldn't have happened. It's unclear what happened during the climb, but the two got separated from each other at some point and would reach the summit separately. As for Frances, she achieved her dream of being the first American woman to summit the mountain, but this feat would come at a heavy price. Just a few minutes after she began her descent, Frances fell sick. She was weak from exhaustion and was suffering from altitude sickness, possibly caused by their prolonged stay in the death zone without supplemental oxygen. And because they were climbing solo, she had no Sherpa support. Sergei was her only climbing partner. But Sergei had summited a few minutes before her and was farther in front. In fact, he would have no clue of what was happening until he got back to camp, only to discover that his wife hadn't arrived yet. Realizing that she had to be somewhere dangerously high up the mountain, Sergei set off to find her, carrying an oxygen tank and medicine. Back up the mountain, Francie's health had deteriorated badly. She was discovered by a team of Uzbek climbers lying helplessly in the snow and badly frostbitten. They tried to stabilize her by giving her some of their oxygen supplies, but her condition had already become critical. In the end, they had to leave her on the mountain. On their way down, they met Sergei, who was looking for his wife. They explained her condition to him, but unfortunately, Sergei never made it to Francis. It is believed that he fell while dragging his equally exhausted body back up the mountain in search of his wife. The next morning, Francis was discovered by another climbing couple, Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd. They didn't even know that she was still alive until they got close to her and found her breathing. She had been lying in the same spot for over 24 hours. Her face was frozen pale white, and her pupils were unfocused. They heard her beg for help, but attempting a rescue mission without the proper equipment and in such poor weather could result in a disaster. They could only comfort her for a while before eventually leaving her on the mountain. Frances died as they found her, lying on her side, still clipped onto the guide rope. Her frozen corpse was nicknamed Sleeping Beauty because of the paleness of her skin and her seemingly peaceful sleeping position. A year later, her husband's body was discovered on the lower part of the mountain with bruises indicating that he had fallen during the search. Unfortunately, the couple met a tragic end on top of Everest due to a series of poor decisions, including their refusal to use supplemental oxygen. Like Francis and Sergei, David Sharp was climbing Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen or a support team. Although he wasn't trying to break any record, Sharp was a purist mountaineer. He was of the philosophy that the true value of mountain climbing was the one done in its traditional form without supplemental oxygen. He had successfully summited Cho Oyu and several 6,000-meter peaks without supplemental oxygen, and in 2006 he decided to replicate it on Everest too. But that wasn't his first summit attempt on Everest. Sharp had previously tried to summit Everest on two different expeditions. First in 2003 and another in 2004, but on both occasions, he never reached the summit. He suffered severe frostbite and exhaustion, and because he couldn't keep up with the rest of his expedition team members, he was made to retreat back to camp. But this didn't stop Sharp from nursing his lifelong dream. So when the opportunity for a third attempt came in 2006, Sharp immediately took it. But this time, he decided to do it alone, without any expedition team or Sherpa support. Not only was he going to climb solo, he intended to do it without supplementary oxygen too, a decision that would prove fatal for him in the end. On May 13th, Sharp began his final ascent to the summit from Camp 4. Because he was climbing alone with no partner or satellite phone, we are unable to get a full account of what happened, but it is assumed that Sharp either reached the summit or turned back due to altitude sickness. Out of exhaustion, he had sought shelter in a rocky overhang known as Green Boots Cave, where another climber's frozen body lay. The distance between the cave and Camp 4 was only 250 meters, 820 feet. But without supplementary oxygen, Sharp was unable to make the descent by himself. Back in Camp 4, Sharp's absence was not noticed until later that evening, but without a satellite phone, there was no way to contact him. Around 1 o'clock a.m. the next morning, Sharp was discovered in Green Boots' cave, sitting with arms clasped around his legs, next to the frozen body of Green Boots. Despite being badly frostbitten, he had survived the night in the cold for hours. Over 40 climbers passed by him that day, but many mistook him for another dead climber. 2 Turkish climbers checked, and upon seeing that he was alive, they gave him something warm to drink and tried to help him move. However, they were forced to leave due to their own depleting oxygen. The men had intended to return to him with oxygen, but had encountered another medical emergency with someone on their team. Shortly after the Turkish climbers left, another group of climbers, led by New Zealand double amputee Mark Inglis, discovered Sharp too. He was severely frostbitten with frozen hands and legs, and after a few failed attempts to help him up his feet, the men gave up and continued their descent. Sharp was left to die next to the body of Green Boots. His death sparked a major debate on the moral obligation of climbers on Everest. But an unspoken rule of mountain climbing is that you are responsible for yourself alone. Attempting to help a person in distress on such dangerous terrain can result in your own death, which is what happened in the case of Rob Hall. Rob Hall was an accomplished mountaineering guide from New Zealand. At the time of his death, Hall had summited Everest 5 times and had successfully guided 39 other climbers through his expedition company called the Adventurous Consultant. And despite charging higher than other expedition companies, Hall's track record of 0 casualties attracted clients to him. He was known to be a highly experienced and reliable mountain guide. Unfortunately, his determination to maintain a casualty-free reputation would cost him his life. On May 10, 1996, Hall led an expedition of 8 clients and 3 guides to the summit of Everest. But upon reaching Hillary Step, the climbers discovered that the safety ropes had not been fixed. The climbers, which consisted of people from different teams, were forced to wait until the ropes were fixed. But as you already know, delays on Everest were dangerous. It wasn't until around 3:00 p.m. that some of the climbers on Hall's team finally made it to the summit. This was past the last recommended time climbers are advised to turn around in order to reach Camp 4 before midnight. They were way behind schedule, but that wasn't the only problem. During his descent, Hall met one of his clients, Doug Hansen, who was still pushing for the summit. Hansen was climbing at a slow pace and had been instructed to turn around and descend, but he refused, pointed to the summit, and continued onward. As an expert climber and team lead, Hall knew the dangers of being on the mountain until evening, but he didn't want to leave his stubborn client on the mountain, so he chose to stay to help him descend. Around 4:00 p.m., Hansen finally summited with the help of Hall, but they were 3 hours behind the turnaround time. Just 30 minutes into their descent, Hansen collapsed. Because of his slow pace, he had used up all of his oxygen supplies and was now suffering from altitude sickness. Hall, who was also thoroughly exhausted at this point, radioed Camp 4 for assistance and fresh supplies. But the response he got from them was chilling. Hall was told to abandon Hansen and save himself as a heavy storm was starting to form. But Hall refused to leave his client. Around 5:00 p.m., Hall's radio cracked to life again, but it wasn't from Camp 4. Harris, a young guide from Hall's team, was a few hundred meters away from Hall and Hansen's position. He had heard the radio chatter and decided to bring the extra oxygen supplies with him to the men. But by this time, a fierce storm had enveloped the mountain, immediately reducing visibility to almost 0. In spite of the raging blizzard, the team back at Camp 4 saw through a telescope as Harris fought his way through the storm toward 2 men. By the time the young guide got to them, Hansen's condition had worsened badly. He was almost unconscious and could barely walk even with assistance. The details of what happened next is not clear, but it is believed that Hansen lost his footing and fell down the southwest face of the mountain, plunging into one of Everest's many crevasses. As for Hall and Harris, the young guide, their condition wasn't any better. The storm had enveloped the whole mountain, and the route to Camp 4 was no longer visible. Left without a choice, the 2 men sought shelter in a small overhang to wait out the storm. But this decision would prove to be fatal. They were badly frostbitten and had spent an unhealthy amount of time on the mountain without supplemental oxygen because their oxygen regulator had been blocked by ice. Harris, who was the youngest, would be the first to suffer from the effects of hypothermia, a condition that causes people to make poor decisions, like removing their warm clothes even in freezing temperatures. Still hallucinating, he wandered half-naked out of the shelter they were in before disappearing into the storm. As for Hall, he was more experienced and had the mental capacity to endure a night in the storm. Around 4 a.m. the next morning, Hall radioed Camp 4, informing them that he was still alive but was unable to climb down due to his frozen hands and feet. A rescue team was immediately sent out, but they were forced to turn back due to the persistent storm still raging outside. Seeing no hope in sight, Hall radioed Camp 4 later that afternoon, asking them to call his pregnant wife Jane on the satellite phone. In his final moment, as he reassured his wife and their unborn baby of his love for them, his last words to her were, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much," before giving up the ghost. 12 days later, his frozen body was discovered near the south summit. He was found huddled together in a sitting position with his and Harris's oxygen bottles surrounding him, possibly to shield him from the wind. In 1999, Hall was posthumously awarded the New Zealand Bravery Star for his actions. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.